The Austro-Hungarian Army marched into the Great War, convinced that sheer size would be enough to prevail. Nearly 8 million men, uniforms spoken in different languages, and a single flag meant to unite what history had long kept divided. But that apparent strength was fragile. Over 4 years of conflict, enemy blockades strangled the economy. Hunger emptied both stomachs and supply depots. Nationalism lit fuses in every corner of the dual monarchy. The High Command tried to contain the crisis with outdated orders and trains that lacked coal. Reality told a different story. Strikes spread, desertions multiplied, and entire regiments stopped responding to an officer's command. This is the story of an empire army that became an army without an empire.
While the French and German armies are locked in a bloody struggle at Verdun, the Russian army is on the march in the east to help its Western allies. General Alexei Brusilov's new tactics and training have revitalized his armies, who are ready to strike the unsuspecting Austro-Hungarians. In just a few weeks, thousands of square kilometers of territory will change hands. Hundreds of thousands of men will be killed or wounded, and the Austro-Hungarian army will be shaken to its core.
The Austro-Hungarian Army was an armed Tower of Babel. Its uniforms projected imperial unity, but beneath them lived more than a dozen nationalities. Each had its own language, loyalties, and idea of homeland. Austrians, Hungarians, Croats, Czechs, Slovens, Poles, Romanians, Italians from Tyrol, all under the same crown, but not under the same inner flag. In the barracks, orders had to be translated. At the front, they were shouted in whatever language the soldier could understand. A centralized command in Vienna and Budapest tried to impose coherence on a mosaic that was already cracking before the first shot was fired. The military structure of the dual monarchy mirrored its political duality. There were 3 armies, the Gemeinsam Heer, the Austrian Landwehr, and the Hungarian Honved. Each had its own command, budget, and even its own administrative language. Coordination was a bureaucratic challenge in peacetime. In war, it turned into chaos. At the top stood the aging Emperor Franz Joseph and his chief of staff, Franz Conrad von Hötzendorf, brilliant in theory, reckless in practice. Decisions were made with the arrogance of a previous century, blind to the industrial scale of the conflict ahead. The army entered the war trusting its numbers and the loyalty of its peoples. Neither would last.
Austrian historian Christian Ortner writes that the Austrian army increasingly developed the Jagdkommandos as a response to the Russians, since Russia seemed the most likely enemy in a major war. However, there were no central army directives for Jagdkommandos, no specialized training, and no overall place in army doctrine. In fact, official Austrian army doctrine had not changed since the 1860s. Emphasis was on infantry, and there was, for example, no coordination with cavalry and artillery.
In 1914, imperial troops crossed the Danube to crush small Serbia. What was meant to be a swift campaign became a nightmare of impassable mountains, disease, and ambushes. To the north, against Russia, the pattern repeated itself. Poorly planned offensives, broken supply lines, and 1 million casualties in the first month alone. Soldiers marched out with dynastic enthusiasm. Those who returned came back broken. They refused to see it, but the explanation was already in front of them.
training emphasized marksmanship and physical fitness, and the infantry was supposed to win on the field by means of all-out vigorous attacks. Willpower and courage were enough to overcome things like artillery or machine guns. Austrian Army Chief of Staff Konrad von Hotzendorf was convinced of this idea, and he was not alone. The French also subscribed to it. This resulted in devastating losses for both nations in the early stages of the war, when infantry attacked modern weaponry and expected to win by willpower alone.
By 1915, the empire was fighting on 3 fronts: the Balkans, the East, and after Italy entered the war, the Alps. Each front drained resources, manpower, and hope. The 12 battles of the Isonzo on the Italian front became a repetitive hell. Months of bombardment to gain a few meters, mountains that swallowed men whole, rivers stained with blood while the map barely moved. The victory at Caporetto in 1917 was little more than a mirage, sustained by German support. Even then, the alliance never truly worked. Each command pursued its own strategy, unwilling to listen to the other. In that clash, the poorly prepared Austro-Hungarian army paid the highest price.
Both the Central Powers flatly refused to help the other and developed largely separate efforts. One bright spot was the addition of the Ottoman 15th Corps to the Eastern Front to help bolster the Central Powers' defenses. The growing animosity between Germany and Austria-Hungary was reflected elsewhere in the East as well. German staff officers like General Linsingen questioned the ability and spirit of Austro-Hungarian colleagues appointed through their dynastic links.
Modern war demanded speed, coordination, and industry. The empire offered slowness, disorder, and a state apparatus on the verge of collapse. Its army was large but deeply uneven. Elite divisions fought alongside untrained peasants. Modern rifles stood next to museum relics. Orders arrived late or vanished within the chain of command. What looked like strength was, in reality, multiplied fragility. As the war dragged on, internal cracks widened into chasms. Hunger spread, strikes became common, faith in the monarchy evaporated. Speeches about unity rang hollow in an army where every nationality dreamed of its own future. President Wilson's 14 points, proposals to negotiate peace in Europe, became ideological ammunition. Among them, the promise of self-determination for oppressed nationalities spread across the front like a clandestine manifesto. Still, the General Staff kept drafting plans with the same stubbornness it had shown in 1914, as if nothing had changed, as if mistakes were not piling up by the day.
Generally, the Austro-Hungarian front line was behind 3 belts of wire and consisted of deep trenches featuring overhead cover, fire steps, timber, concrete emplacements, and nearby shelters. Lines were spaced out about 50 to 100 meters apart, but although the front trenches were heavily reinforced, those further back were not. In some places, Austro-Hungarian rear lines were poorly constructed and, according to Brusilov, comfort trumped defensibility.
By 1918, the Austro-Hungarian army was no longer fighting. It was surviving. The trenches on the Italian front were damp graves. Malaria, typhus, and dysentery caused more devastation than artillery fire. Field hospitals were overwhelmed. Doctors improvised with dirty bandages and diluted morphine. Army records showed that deaths from disease surpassed combat casualties. Hunger was the constant enemy. Daily rations barely reached 1,000 calories, not enough to keep exhausted men standing. Soldiers ate roots, dead horses, even rats. Boots were patched with rope, uniforms passed from the living to the dead. In some battalions, the average soldier's weight dropped to starvation levels. The empire that boasted of discipline had turned its soldiers into beggars with rifles. The Allied blockade paralyzed the economy. Without coal, trains stopped. Without trains, artillery never reached the front. As if that were not enough, the remaining artillery crews suffered from the same lack of training as the infantry.
The Austrians positioned their artillery just behind the front as well to give it maximum range. Despite their strong positions, the passivity of the Austro-Hungarians created problems. Hardly any thought was given to active defenses, counterattacking, or withdrawing, while training had been replaced with digging and snow clearing.
Problems continued to pile up. The war industry, starved of raw materials, barely produced enough ammunition to maintain the illusion of combat. Railway convoys were looted by desperate peasants. In the rear, industrial strikes in Vienna and Budapest froze the last gears of the war effort. In July 1918, a new invisible enemy entered the ranks. The Spanish flu. Within weeks, tens of thousands of soldiers fell ill. Trenches turned into improvised cemeteries, mixing victims of disease and battle. The Piave front was no longer a defensive line. It became a field of agony. Disillusion spread like a moral contagion. Soldiers' letters spoke of despair. We are not fighting for the emperor, but for a piece of bread. Rumors of peace traveled faster than orders. Officers still spoke of sacrifice and honor, but their words no longer echoed. Patriotic songs gave way to silence. Desertions multiplied. Some fled back to their villages. Others surrendered to the enemy, convinced that Italian captivity meant better food. Executions for insubordination no longer inspired fear. Even officers understood that shooting a starving man was pointless. Surrender became the most rational option.
The attackers captured huge numbers of Austro-Hungarians, as one new prisoner of war recalled. All resistance was useless. Machine guns already stood in front of every entrance to the caves. The trenches had been taken.
Everything collapsed into disaster. Morale crumbled, and with it, authority. Orders were debated. Local commanders acted according to convenience or nationality. Soldiers read pamphlets in Czech or Hungarian promising independence, and many trusted them more than communiques from Vienna. The army meant to hold the empire together became its laboratory of dissolution. By late summer, the situation was unsustainable. Empty warehouses, immobilized locomotives, and epidemics turned the rear into ruins. What was still called the front was little more than a line of exhausted men without ammunition or conviction. At that point, politics fully seeped into the bayonets. Soldiers no longer fought for a monarchy they did not believe in. They fought to survive until someone signed peace. Autumn 1918 arrived with the certainty that the end was near. In Vienna, generals still planned offensives the army could no longer execute. On the ground, the war ended without proclamations. There was simply no strength left to continue. In October, Hungary broke with Austria. The Czechoslovak National Council was recognized by the Allies as the future legitimate authority. South Slavs began organizing their own state. Within days, the empire ceased to be a whole and became a sum of fragments. Reflecting that collapse, the army stopped obeying. On October 21st, of the 57 divisions deployed on the Italian front, 21 refused to follow orders. In the camps, imperial flags were replaced with improvised national symbols, Czech cockades, Hungarian scarves, Croatian insignia. Desertions numbered in the thousands. Officers, powerless, realized they no longer commanded an army, but a scattered mass united only by exhaustion. 3 days later, on October the 24th, Italy launched its final offensive at Vittorio Veneto. The imperial response was little more than an echo. Guns without ammunition and trains without coal sealed the fate of the Dual Monarchy. The Piave line shattered like glass. Divisions retreated in disorder. What began as a battle turned into a general rout. By October 27th, 13 full divisions vanished from the records. Some surrendered. Others dissolved into the Alpine valleys. Roads filled with starving soldiers dragging rusted rifles. Discipline evaporated. In many units, officers burned the flags to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. What remained of imperial authority disintegrated under the roar of Italian aircraft. At the same time, the political map of the empire was being rewritten at breakneck speed. On October 28th, Prague proclaimed the independence of Czechoslovakia. On the 29th, the South Slavs announced the creation of the state of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. On the 30th, Hungary declared itself sovereign. In just 3 days, the imperial mosaic exploded into new flags. On October 31st, Emperor Karl I accepted the inevitable. Isolated at Schönbrunn, he signed the order to cease hostilities. At the front, no one waited for instructions. The war had ended on its own. Soldiers abandoned their weapons and walked back to villages that now belonged to new countries. At the stations, trains filled with veterans without a nation. The final numbers were as cold as they were unforgiving. 1.2 million dead, 3.6 million wounded, 2.2 million prisoners or missing. The collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Army was more than a military defeat. It was the implosion of an entire world. No Allied offensive could have succeeded without the internal collapse of a system starved of economic oxygen, stripped of political legitimacy, and lacking a nation to sustain it. Modern war demanded unity, industry, and belief. The empire had none of the three. Its coal-less trains, its artillery without horses, and its orders without obedience revealed a hollow colossus.